Hey everybody, thank you for joining me this beautiful morning, and thank you Lightbox Expo for having me. I'm really excited. I do love this event. I think we are approaching 10 a.m. and I'll be starting. So, who, what, why? Really short introduction. My name is Alexi. I currently work as art director at Blur Studio, and I oversee most of the projects done in the studio. From the recent highlights is Terminator Dark Fate, Netflix series Love, Death and Robots, and countless game cinematics. I'm using here League of Legends as an example, but in fact I've been working on most of the game cinematics done at Blur in the past 3-4 years. Uh, as art director, I do very different things. I work with concepts and I work with production support, but one of the focus areas for me is light and color scripting. I thought I will talk about it a little bit. First of all, I do a lot of this stuff, but also it's one of my favorite areas of research and interest, and I do love cinematography and looking at it and talking about it and trying to systemize it. Now, what is cinematography and color scripting is really about? That is, if you think about this question, it's about making shots beautiful, it's about telling the stories, it's about making things work in continuity, but if you try to wrap it in one phrase, for me, it's about converting verbal storytelling into visuals. And, it's in a very literal way as you get a script as an input and you need to come up with an images to tell this script, to tell the story. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not only about color scripting and cinematography, it's also about storyboards, environment concepts, and character concepts. It's all these things that work together to make images out of words, and it's the most fundamental process in filmmaking for me. Now, when it comes to color scripting, I do love the quote from Nathan Folks. I think he posted it somewhere in ArtStation next to his images, and he writes, "I like to think of the color script as being the visual equivalent of the musical score. It's meant to guide your emotions through the story." I think it's a brilliant quote, and I do think, I just couldn't tell it better. But also, the important connection here is between the color script, the images, and the story. It's meant to tell the story, and it's meant to make it stronger. It's meant to make proper emphasis and put proper accents. Now, what does that actually mean? What means converting verbal storytelling into visuals? Just to systemize it a little bit, I would say it's that each frame tells the story the best way possible. Each frame communicates the emotions that are needed. It supports the performance of the character, either animated or actor. And then the second most important thing is that it has to work in sequence. It's not the frame that makes the movie, it's a sequence of frames in continuity that actually make the movie. So the continuity and sequential part of it is very, very important. Now, I'll briefly focus on both of these points, and then I'll just show you some of my work that I've been doing in the past, and I'll try to outline some of the principles that I use and give you a quick sneak peek into my process. Now, each frame tells the story the best way possible. When you work in production, when you work with lighters and compositors, or you work in pre-production with people, with director, cinematographer, or whoever is around you, the most common question is, what is the shot about? What we're trying to say here? What story we're trying to tell? And I guess there are a few examples, and what is this shot about? Well, it's about the man sitting in the car during the nighttime. And what is this shot really about? Well, it's sort of about the same, a man sitting in the car during the nighttime. And this shot, it's the same story, the man sitting in the car during the nighttime. Now, I'm definitely missing something there, because it's not only about that. If all these three shots were only about the man sitting in the car during the nighttime, then why would they be different? Why would they be so different emotionally? And that brings you, to thinking about the story context a little bit. Starting with the screen right frame with Brad Pitt, it's a frame from the Fight Club, and Brad Pitt's character is driving fast on the highway, and he's about to let the steering wheel go and lose control of the car and get into the car crash, and he's full on adrenaline, he's going crazy, going insane. And if you look at the shot, the lighting does support that emotion really well. The lighting does support his performance well. You have a very sharp contrast. You have bright highlights, very dark shadows. You have highlights on his eyes, which is, a little over what you would consider realistic. And these all things do work for his performance. These all things help to communicate his mental state. If you look at the frame in the center of the slide, it's the frame from the movie Magnolia, and Tom Cruise's character is about to have one of the hardest conversations in his life. He's about to talk to a father with whom he didn't talk in maybe 20 years, and he's debating in the car whether he should do it or not, and has some internal philosophical debate. And the lighting and color does support that pretty well. It is very minimalistic, it's almost monochromatic, the whole focus around the character, his facial performance. And the last frame on the screen left is from Nightcrawler, and the main character is sort of stalking and living the double life, and he's sort of into a gray area of human moral, and the lighting does support it again really well. You have his upper face in the shadow, you have a little bit of emphasis on the eyes, but overall it works on communicating what this character is. Now, wrapping it about, it's not only the objective fact of what's happening. The man is sitting in the car. It is about our perception of character's emotional state. Again, Brad Pitt is going crazy. The lighting supports this really well. You have a very hard contrast. You have insane highlights in the eyes to show his mental state. The same on the other two shots. And I do think that it's often about that. It's often not only about communicating objective reality, but it's about communicating our perception of characters' emotional state. Now, our perception is a very important part here. First of all, because we don't really know what the character's emotional state is. We know what their actions are and what their words are, but we don't know what they feel. So it's our perception of what they feel, and it's our perceptions that we're trying to show. But then the second important thing here is that if you give, for example, a script for the screenwrite image for 3 different artists, they will come up with 3 different images, and that is what it also makes as a personal perception of the story by the artist. Different artists will come up with different images, and as much as I wish there were rules to telling stories visual or building light and color schemes, there is no really rules, and it's about you going through the story, internalizing it, feeling it, and coming up with the visual idea. That is why it is often really our perception and our look at the story. And that is also, it's a hard part here because you have to work emotionally, you have to feel the story. But also, it's a beautiful thing that makes artist and not a technician. That is what these individual differences of our ideas and perceptions of the stories and individual ways we come up with telling the stories is what makes us unique artists. Now, again, as I said, I do feel like there is a lot of cliches in visual storytelling, but I don't think there is any particular rules on how you tell the stories. The more I talk to people and the more I do this job myself, I feel like it's really based on our own experience, visual experience, and in a way, life experience. One thing that helps me a lot is, I do these warm-ups and I do paint a lot of frames from movies. Sometimes I do it each morning. Sometimes I have little pauses, but I just feel like it's a great way to build your visual library and really collect all the visual ideas to have them in the back of your mind and study it. Now, going to the second thing. It has to work in a sequence. And what it means, there is obvious things like continuity and technical things that make a movie, but then there is also higher concepts. And I collected a few examples from the movies when light and color actually puts a good emphasis on the story. These two shots are from the Revenant movie, and these two sequences go back to back in the movie, and the screenshot on the left is the flashback sequence of main character remembering some events from the past, remembering his child, and things like that, whereas the frame on the right is a real-time story of him walking through the Arctic Canada. Now, while these two frames are sort of generally monochromatic, the separation between the flashback and the real-time storytelling is very clear. The flashback is warmer tones, soft lights, almost sepia tones, but not overly stylized. You still feel like it can be a natural lighting. This screenshot on the right is very cold and the lighting is harder and even the sun highlights are cold. So these two things are just good enough to separate flashback from the real-time storytelling, which works really well for the movie. The other example is, and the flashbacks are generally simple. We have this instinct to separate them from the story and to really just make sure that it reads as a flashback. It gets more complex when it is within the real-time storytelling. And one good example is the movie Seven, when the whole movie is happening in the gray, overcast, rainy city. There is no sun, there is no warm tones, it's all blue and greens. And only the last sequence happens outside the city in extremely warm and bright environment. And this is the scene of direct confrontation between the characters, and it also, the color and lighting separates it so well from the edit that it just makes a good emphasis. Another example, very similar, but that's the movie Arrival, and the whole movie is set in sort of underlit, darker conditions. It's all twilight, blue hour. I would say it's brilliantly underlit in a way that you just see enough. You don't see a lot of things, and there is no high contrast. But then, when main characters come into the alien ship, it suddenly becomes very bright and overlaid, and also it becomes very neutral in color, whereas the whole movie is tinted bluish and greenish. The spaceship interior part is very neutral, white, and it builds a very nice separation between the human world and the world of alien spaceship. Now the last example is very similar. In fact, it's the movie 1917, and again the movie covers somewhat 36 hours. It's one shot movie, and most of it is set in overcast grayish environment. And there is obviously a night scene, and there is a lot of change within that, but still the tonality is sort of toned down. It's grayish, it's rainy, and it's only the last scene when we first see this, the sunlight. It's the last scene when we first see the sunlight touching the character's face, and overall the image becomes much warmer. Now, that is just, a brief introduction that two things that I do love to think about in color scripting is basically making each frame to tell the story, but then making sure that the whole color and light dynamics does support the dramatic structure of the story. I'll go into a few examples just to show you my work. Those are based on my Love, Death and Robots work, and I'll start with the Drowned Giant. Now, I started to work on the project quite early in the process, typically much earlier than you would typically start color scripting, and at that moment in time in the project we didn't have a clear vision for each scene, and we really didn't know when, like, time of day for each scene, mood for each scene, and we needed to come up and brainstorm with ideas. And as much as it's tempting to just go ahead and start painting, I thought I would do just a Ripple color script. I just collected some references and put them on timeline of the story, and saw how it all looks together and how it works in context. And now just a very brief introduction to the story. It is set somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Great Britain, in the coastal town, where suddenly one day the giant body of colossal man appears on this beach. And the whole piece is about main character reflecting on this event and internalizing it and talking about it in the form of monologue. Now, I basically put the cards for each scene and pitched it to the director, and it seemed that it builds and adds dynamics through the piece, and we decided to go for it and develop it further. So while just collecting references and thinking about the project, I came with several key ideas for what would be light and color art direction for it. And one thing is that our character comes to the same location several times during the piece, and it makes sense to change this location for each visit. It is the beach with the giant. Now, my biggest, internal question was like, man, but how do I change it? What is the logic in it? And I realized that I have a huge benefit of character talking about his mental state and talking about his perception of this giant body on the beach. And what we can actually do is reconstruct what would environment look for him to say the words he said. It's sort of a mental game when you know what your character feels, and now you need to build what he saw to say what he said. And anyway, we came with the idea that environment will be the reflection of main character's state of mind and his inner emotion and his perception of the giant, and we definitely wanted to change it from scene to scene. And few other things. Obviously, we had an original prose by J.G. Ballard that gave us a lot of clues on just mood and visual ideas. And then one thing on just general art direction approach is this is fundamentally a magical story. It's a magical realism. A giant appears in a modern day world, and we wanted to tell this story the most non-magical and common way possible. We didn't want to go very magical with our images, and we wanted to build a contrast between the magical giant and ordinary, boring English countryside. And then obviously a technical scene. Again, our character comes to the same beach from scene to scene, and we definitely needed to make it a clear read that this is different days, this is different time of day, different weather. You know, there is several changes here and there. We just needed to make sure that it doesn't feel like one continuous day. Now, I touched on the style, but when it comes to lighting style and, you know, in a way, color stylization, there's different ways of doing it. We really didn't want to go overly magical, and I was looking a lot into different cinematographers, and it seemed and it felt for us that Emmanuel Lubezki is a good example of how you can make things look realistic, but at the same time beautiful. He's known for not using too much lighting equipment in set, and he utilizes natural lighting a lot, and we felt that this is just appropriate for this story. Again, more frames from Emmanuel Lubezki's different movies. And then, in addition to that, we've been looking a lot at Arrival, just because it is all toned down and very simple lighting color schemes, not a lot of beautifying. We also were looking into Leviathan, is a Russian movie, and it's sort of set in a very similar environment. It's a northern town in Russia, and what I loved about it is how toned down the depiction of epic nature there, and how ordinary, beautiful things feel, and we just felt that it is very appropriate to our project again. A few more examples, but they all go around the same idea, to keep lighting and color as simple, realistic, and minimalistic as possible. A quick sum up: realistic lighting style dictated by the state of environment and weather. And here's the thing that is very, you know, I felt is good to realize that if you work on set, you don't control your natural environment. You came on set, there is sunny, you have to shoot a sunny scene. You came on set, it's rainy, you have to shoot a rainy scene. Of course, there is ways to control it, but still it's very expensive and hard. Whereas in computer graphics, it's sort of very easy, and you know, you want a sunset, you will have a sunset. You want rain, you will have a rain. And we wanted really to utilize it, and rather than art direct lighting around the characters, we wanted to art direct the state of nature. We also wanted to use as least beautifying lighting on the portraits and characters as possible, and we tried, you know, to get a shape and form readability from what natural lighting gives you, rather than, you know, adding lots of fake light. Now, just before jumping into real frames, one thing that really helped, and it's a huge thanks to Epic Games team, because they do really wanted to help us with Unreal, and they helped us to build a real beach location. We never rendered it for final frames, but we used it for pre-production. And one thing that was extremely helpful is rendering time-lapse. We basically rendered a time lapse of the beach from multiple cameras, and that gave us a lot of good ideas of what the lighting could be. Do you want to shoot during the morning when the sun is behind the character's back and there is long shadows from the dunes and only the giant is lit by the sun, or do you want it to shoot during the midday or during the sunset when the sun sets somewhere in the ocean? That thing, I usually all about going and just painting things and coming with visual ideas while you paint, but this was extremely helpful. For example, again, we have a very similar state of lighting in the final piece, and I'm not sure if I would have came up with this idea if I didn't do this Unreal exercise, because it's just very specific thing when you have a very long shadows from the dunes, and it's very location based specific state of lighting. Here's a few more screenshots from our Unreal setup. It's extremely ugly. I'm no way an Unreal TD, and I'm no way specialist in it, but yet it was extremely helpful to have these as a way to brainstorm ideas and come with a very rough first pass images. But now finally going to the color script, one thing to keep in mind, there is few very mild gore images showing amputation of the giant. Please, if you're uncomfortable, just turn away from the screen when you see them. But it shouldn't be shocking or anything. I tried to keep it as as toned down as possible. So again, we start all the story in the boring English countryside, and it's gray, cold environment, but it's not too dark, not too bright. It's sort of perfect middle of nowhere. And then our character comes to the beach. At the moment when he comes, he's skeptical about the giant. He thought it's sort of an optical illusion or, interpretation of the people, but he didn't believe into the idea of giant existence till he saw it himself. Now, when he sees the giant, he approaches it and walks around it, and we start to slowly introduce sunlight. And this sunlight is meant to help the transition from boring countryside into something more magical and special. So as the character walks around it, with each shot the idea was to introduce more and more sunlight until we end up in a fully sunlit afternoon, which does feel much more magical and special. And that is also the moment that when main protagonist starts to talk about the giant feeling alive and just asleep, and he doesn't think of it as of dead body, he thinks of it as a live character. And then, there is a beautiful afternoon, sunset state of nature there, and we end up the scene with the sunset. But what main character says is, but as time passed, the magical spell cast by the giant began to dissipate. And I did a lot of color script studies, whether it should be a beautiful epic sunset or something more toned down, but it felt more appropriate to feel it very toned down and not very epic Hollywood beautiful, just to support the things that main character said. And so that's how we end the first scene. And a few days later, the main character comes again to the beach, and he starts to talk about the giant, about something being alive and something, he says that it feels more alive than many people he knows. And in order to support it, we actually went for this morning lighting setup that we discovered in Unreal, and that I felt is very appropriate for that. And now it's very challenging to have a light behind the camera, whether you're painting or you're rendering, but because of launch shadows, that's kind of what helped us to maintain shaping and separation in the scene. Now, overall, this is the brightest moment from the whole story, and it was exactly because of what main character actually says and thinks during this scene. The next visit to the beach happens a few days later, and so there is just a phrase from main character that I deliberately postponed my visit until late afternoon, hoping that I'd find fewer people on the beach. That is, that sort of sets the tone for the scene. You had to make it late in the evening, but at the same time, I think this is the most important scene in the piece for me, because that is where main protagonist changes his perception of the giant. In the beginning, he talks about the giant of still being alive and maybe feeling older than it felt a few days before, but he still doesn't make accents on the fact that it's just a dead body. While closer to the end of the scene, the main character climbs on the giant's body and walks around it, and he discovers the first amputation happened, and looks into the eyes of the giant, and in the end we leave the character in the full blue hour. So within the scene we try to transition from something warmer and still with a bit of sun to something cold and generally darker. And this is not only the transition about this particular scene, it is the transition for the whole piece, because after this scene we keep the piece generally we keep the mood generally gray and overcast and on the darker side of things, because it's much more about amputation and vandalism people do to the body, and generally main protagonist's thought process switches to something way darker. Now, again, I'm sorry for gore details, but this scene was particularly challenging for me because I'm not the huge gore guy. I'm not a fan of, showing cut out limbs and things like that. And I was like, man, how do I paint it and not paint all these details? Because I don't want it. And in fact, I don't want the audience to see it. And so I just was on the beach and I saw this state of nature when the sky is cloudy and dark, but the sun is still very bright. This state of weather creates very uncomfortable contrast when you basically can't expose neither for shadows nor for highlights. It is always going to be something out of the range, but it sort of helps me to get the mood through the lighting rather than showing all the details and all the gory things that I just didn't want to show and didn't want to paint, in fact. And after this scene, the scenes are going darker, and this is the last visit of main characters to the beach, and it's all, very dark and stays mostly in grays, and we used a little bit of fog to just create a proper mood. But after the last visit to the beach, we have a piece of the story that is actually happening after the giant lost its human form, and the main character just travels around the city and sees how this magical event affected the life of the city and life of the life of people. And what we didn't want to leave people in a dark, moody state of mind. We wanted to ease out to something more normal and something that feels, in a way, hopeful, but not too much. So we slowly ease out through, introducing a little bit of sun, a little bit of warmth to the images, and we end up on the sunset. Now, this sunset was a big thing with the discussion between me, director, CG supervisor, because we tried a lot of things. We didn't want to have epic Hollywood sunset because it just felt inappropriate for the story. But at the same time, we still wanted some hope. So we came up with this image that sort of stayed true in the final piece. When it's sunsetty, you have some warmth in the sky, you have, generally magenta, magical tones, but it's not over the top. And so just to show you the whole picture, because all these images were meant to create a flow, and again, we started in the gray and boring British countryside. We went very bright and sunny in the scene when main character talks about Giant being alive, and then we slowly transition to a very dark mood where we see all the gore details and what people did to the body. And then, just again to leave our audience a little more hopeful, we end up with the sunset, which is a little higher than the beginning. And that is the whole flow, and that is, in the end of the day, we also created music that followed this flow, and we tried to maintain it in production as close as possible to that. Yeah, this is on Drum Giant. I'll give you guys time to ask any questions, or I'll try to keep my eye on the comments, but please post any questions if you have. Now, so Pop Squad, that is another piece for Love, Death and Robots, and the story is very different. Just to give you a quick outline, it happens in dystopian future. In this future, there is extreme birth control. Basically, people are not allowed to have babies just because they live forever. So you basically can't allow people to be born, because otherwise they're going to be overpopulation. And so there is a special police unit that hunts people who are having babies, and basically they put these people into prison and they kill children. So that is the general outline of the story. Now, before even starting doing anything, I was reflecting on the story and just trying to systemize it for myself and see what is the logic here. And if in Drum Giant I was working in continuity, in this story I just realized that there is 3 worlds here. There is a world that I call Above the Cloud. It's a city where the wealthy people live, who live forever, they enjoy their life, they have just endless party, and they don't care about anything, their life is beautiful. And then there is a city below the clouds, which is dark, dystopian, gray place where nobody really lives. It's abandoned buildings most of the time, and it's ruins, but people who want to have babies actually have to hide there. And finally, the 3rd world in this story is a house in the jungle, where our main character protagonist confronts a mother who has a child, and our main character has an internal debate whether to kill a child or let it live and kill himself. Now, before painting anything, I put this board in Miro and pitched it to director, and what I tried to get with this mood board is a clear separation between the 3 worlds. And as soon as I got it, I felt like I'm ready to go and do some actual paintings. So again, we open the scene. The main character comes, it's slums part. It's below the sky, always rainy part of city. Main character comes into apartments and he finds a child there that he has to kill. And one of the reference, and again, look, here's the thing. It's sort of people not always show their reference. I feel like it always stays below the ground. I know a lot of people, do their researches, and if you work with DOPs on set, they're gonna have a huge decks of frame examples, or art directors in the studios would have a lot of references. And I do love showing references, and it doesn't mean that I stole everything, but it's just where my inspiration comes from and where the ideas come from. So for this scene, I used Enter the Void movie by Gaspar Noé, a French director, and it brilliantly utilizes the red and green color palette. It's a very high contrast color palette, and it's sort of dangerous because it's easy to lose control over it. But just the way it's used here felt very, very appropriate to me. It feels heavy. It feels thick and sick and unhealthy, and we sort of wanted this feeling. But now, as our character transitions from the world below the clouds into the party above the clouds, we wanted this transition to feel as powerful as possible. So below the clouds we are all in the green and gray tones, dark and moody, whereas above the clouds there is a crystal clear sky, there is a sunset, golden tones, there is magenta to build contrast with the greens, yeah, that transition was very important. Then there is a party happening. Again, we went for the bright colors. We were inspired a lot by Art Deco sort of mood and Art Deco architecture, but we wanted to introduce some futuristic touch, but then some unhealthy touch to it. So we added a little bit of like a black light, deep blues to the scene to have a good contrast in it. And after the party, there is a hospital scene where they basically take medicine to live forever, and we wanted to feel as trippy and as airy as possible, very lightweight. On one hand, it's a golden light, but we didn't want it to be very positive sunlight. We wanted to have some sort of, unhouselessness to the image. After the hospital scene, there is a love scene, or let's say love attempt scene in the car, and the idea was to use a bounce light to light the main characters and shape them. So imagine the light hits the seats and then bounces back to their faces to shape them. And one important thing to understand, just the physics about the bounce light, but the more light bounces around, generally speaking, the warmer it gets. And that what kind of can help you always to separate the temperature between the bounce light and the sunlight, and that's what can give you a proper warm tones that would work with the intense love scene. And one of the references for these sequences was Oblivion, because it sort of comes naturally, because in the movie they have this part of the movie which is set in the tower high above the clouds, and it's sort of idealistic interior and it's idealistic environment, yet they managed to make it feel unhealthy and like something is wrong. sort of thing. And that is what, we went for. We changed it quite a bit, hopefully. And again, it's not that I'm showing the frames that I'm ripping off, but it's my inspiration. And I think, we need to be honest about the things that inspire us. And so after that scene, it goes to, again, to a darker under city, and it's all greens and reds again. And I kept these frames very loose just because I needed to work really fast. But yeah, that is just, in this particular bit, it was just build the contrast as much as possible, and contrast in two ways. First, it needs to be very different from the city above, so it needs to be darker, greener, but also there is a shootout happening and an action scene, so there needs to be a color contrast within the sequence itself. So we introduced this red police car lights just to, again, to go punchy with color. One of the references for the sequence was obviously movie 7, and especially this frame, because the whole scene is sort of monochromatic and stays in the straighted blues, but this one crazy red stoplight just gave me the idea to go, okay, let's take it, but let's just make it on steroids. Let's go crazy with the red and green color contrast. And then there is a more personal scene within the car when when main character goes through some sort of internal experience, and he just doesn't feel himself well, and he starts to internalize what just have happened. And we basically, again, my thought process was to introduce as much color contrast and as much contrast overall as possible. Also, the idea was to sort of hide his eyes and have them feel black and just described with reflection. But, in the end, our character comes to the collectible toy shop. He's just following some storyline where he meets this woman, and he following her. Now, the collectible toy shop is just the idea that nobody needs toys in the future, so there is a shop where just some weird collectors come in to buy things. And the mother character is basically the second main character of the story, and they will have a big argument in the end of the story. And we were thinking how to separate her from the rest of the characters. And we thought, okay, we keep everything either rainy or soft lit, and we will let the sunlight in the whole story to only hit this character. And that's what would make her feel so much healthier than the rest. At least that was our idea. And so we went for it in the interior scene when the sun comes in, hits a little bit of her dress, and then bounces on her to give her warmth. And when she exits the store and the sun is hitting her upper body. But anyway, main character follows, and he comes into her house. And this is sort of the third world in this story. And what is important here, you have these people having ongoing party, just living 300 years in the upper world. And then you have these people who are hiding in the slums in complete darkness. And both felt very unhealthy, and what we wanted to create is that this mother living in the house in the jungle is a level of normality. That is the most, we wanted it to feel as the most healthy images, and obviously we wanted to hit the child with the sunlight and give a lot of warmth and a bounce light and give her enough sunlight too. And one of the references was the Captain Fantastic movie, which just has a lot of lush green tones and beautiful sunsets, and which feels very healthy and idyllic. And frames on the left is the movie Duelist. It's a Russian movie, and it's a good one actually. And they have a very nice rain scene with a lot of depth, and at the same time, sun going through the rain. So we went with these frames. We wanted the same vibe. We wanted the rain, but we wanted the sun. And that's what's happening here. Is the when finally our character decides that, well, I can't kill children anymore, really, and he walks away and he has a shootout with his colleague and he dies in the end. That is the first time in the story when we hit his face with the direct sunlight. It's the moment when he actually dies, and but also sort of frees himself, and yeah, so that was the very important thing, just to and I know it was a very big production challenge for lighters and compositors and other guys, just to keep him away from the sunlight just until the very last shot of the movie. Yeah, so that is the key ideas. It's a clear juxtaposition between three works of the story, and sunlight never touches main character till the very last shot. That's sort of all I've got, but I have one more color script that I can guide you through, guys, and I see we have time. I'll just have a quick look at the questions, and then if we still have time, I'll go for one more thing. So I'll go from the bottom of the chat. How closely does the light in comp artist follow the color script's case? How often does changes happen in production? Is there freedom for light comp artists to suggest and change things? Well, it really depends on the piece. So now look, what you're trying to do is really to give guys a good guide. Often your ideas work, and I would say between the two color scripts that I showed, the Drowned Giant one worked much closer in the end, where there were a few scenes in Pop Squad that changed here and there. And again, guys have a lot I feel like they have freedom to experiment with light direction and sometimes temperatures, but if you develop a bigger ideas, you want this whole thing to work in continuity. And basically, as much as you want lighters and compositing artists to have the input, you still want to work the story as a whole. You still want it to, you still want to make the accents where you want them to be, and you want the whole dynamic to work well. But another question. Hello Alexei, do you have any recommendation on good book sites to learn more about color script and color storytelling, especially for cinematic lighting? Well, the first, booking site would be just go and watch movies. That is the first thing. I actually can quickly switch it off. The second thing that you can go is Shutdeck. That is my favorite resource, but it's basically a collection of movie frames, and you can browse, and if you don't use it, I seriously recommend subscribe, because you can sort by genre and by composition and by lighting style, lighting type, and all these things. This is a brilliant resource for reference gathering. And then the other thing that definitely go and see is Schoolism. You probably know it, but there is lots of courses on light and color. There is some brilliant things that you can learn from Pixar and DreamWorks guys, and it's just seriously, it is the best it gets in terms of learning. But one other thing, I do feel like, especially in movies, it's such a subjective scene that I would really recommend just doing these studies. Just go to Shutdeck, pick the frame you like, and try to paint, and try to focus on what really matters and what is important. And yeah, and very similar question. Are there any helpful resources you recommend to get better at understanding light and color? Honestly, just watch movies. One big thing is, additionally, if you're really interested, subscribe to American cinematographer. It's, I guess, where it is, ACMAC, yeah. Subscribe to American Cinematographer magazine. They have monthly issues. They write a lot about, you know, how cinematographers work, and for me, it's very valuable resource just to see what people live on set with and how they, you know, what the air they breathe and what are their challenges and what their inspirations. So, though it's not animation related, I would really recommend it. And then, yeah, I think I covered all the questions, guys. Yeah, I hope I haven't missed anything. And look, let me show you one last call script. It's not as probably, you know, it's a little different, and I'm not as prepared to talk about it right now, but I'll just go for it. So it's, again, Love, Death and Robots. It's Love and Death and Robots Volume 2. It's Life Hatch episode, and basically the story. Humans fighting aliens in the space. One guy's spaceship got a hit and he lands on a planetoid which is completely not for life, and he finds a life hatch, escapes, hides there, and then he, you know, there is a robot going crazy that tries to kill this guy. And so there's a few sequences again, and I do like to think about it this way, like, rather than often going just in continuity, just separate the worlds of your story and find a difference with them, and then continuity and edit will come together. And so the first big bit of it is a space fight, and the guy is just fighting his space jet fighter and shoots rockets. And the idea behind the lighting scheme was just to have a sunlight to light the character, to hit him with a bright, intense lighting, but then have these alien structures give a warm light onto the character. And the whole dynamics was, as the main character approaches the alien structures, he gets into the shadow of them, and it just basically there is no sunlight. So at some point, the image becomes so intense and so monochromatic that it's only his helmet lights and maybe highlights in the eyes that separates you just from fully monochromatic orange lighting. And that was just the dynamic to show, like, one thing, you know, you're flying from alien spaceship 10 miles away, and other thing being close to it and just showing the danger. But then, you know, there is a lot of lasers going on, and honestly, some of these frames were just to prototype how the effects should look, and how, you know, just to get a good guide for effects artists. But then he gets hit, the light goes off in his spaceship. He's alone, you know, in the darkness, trying to fix the spaceship and jumpstart it, and then he jumpstarts it, and he lands on the planetoid, which is completely inhuman place to be in. It's a dark black planet with almost zero atmosphere, just a little bit of haze and a super bright sky. And then somewhere in the distance he sees the flashing light of the life hatch. He approaches it, enters the life hatch. The you know, the life hatch is quite brightly lit. And the whole idea through these all frames was that let our character chase the light. Let it start with the flashlight here that he's looking for, and then there is light in the distance, and then there's a very bright light on the life hatch that just flashes everything around. And then he enters the life hatch, and then the other story starts when he's inside the life hatch and he fights this robot dog. Now we shot some of these, and I did some basic grading onto, you know, it's just some wages on how I was trying to push the initial sources to, you know, to get a little more tension in them. But at the same time, I should say that it's just a brilliant cinematographer's work. And then, you know, after that, it all goes through the, you know, the story goes through fighting with the robot dog. And the whole idea was, let's keep the dusty pinks and magentas, and let's use the robot dog's eye as an extremely bright green light source. Again, just to emphasize the color contrast and emphasize the significance of the creature, and just, you know, so it doesn't feel too monochromatic. And so there's a bunch of shots in the interior, all sort of staying in the same vibe. And only in the very end, when the character basically kills this robot dog, we introduce again some sort of normal warm lighting, which is I just like this idea, and especially it often works in the with the endings of the story, that you kind of want this normality level. Okay, we pass the tension, we pass the fight and violence, and you want it like just the character just sits down and rests and tells the joke. So let's just have as normal, healthy looking image as possible within this setup. So that's where the warm lights came and from. But anyway, that's the contact sheet. I don't think it's all the frames are painted, but it's most of them. And so, yeah, question. Yeah, that's clearly everything I have to show, guys, and I'll take another pass on questions. What exercise would you suggest for understanding composition, contrast grouping values? Does graphic thumbnailing help? Yeah, I think graphic thumbnailing definitely helps. Again, I would just try to study movie frames and probably, you know, try to keep your painting as loose as possible. But there's no better exercise than just studying something that looks beautiful and trying to understand how it works. Graphic thumbnailing definitely helps. It just, you know, when you do the studies, it is always a challenge to understand how far to push it. And what I like to do is to keep it as simple as possible, as graphic as possible, and still get a clear read before you start adding details. Because in the end of the day, your study is not about a beautiful image. It's like the image I showed you in the beginning that I will never ever honestly post online or show, like, maybe I'll post it one day on Instagram, but the idea is that, you know, it's not my work. It's the director and DOP and production designer who created this frame. I only just did some brush strokes and tried to learn from them. But the faster you can do it, if you can, like, I try to limit myself with like 20 minutes for a study as a maximum, and then yeah, try to keep it as simple as possible, at least at the first, because there is no point in detailing this image because it will never be my work, right? So it's just trying to study the most efficient way possible. Um, Now, question, what software do you use for code scripts? If Photoshop, what brushes do you use? I use Photoshop. I do sometimes, some pre-rendered images. I would render in Arnold, or I would get stuff in Unreal Engine. But most of the times I paint in Photoshop. Honestly, I have unhealthy huge brush collection, which is not helpful at all. I Most of the time nowadays I use just a simple round brush. I don't use, or I have one texture brush and like just something for finishing. But most of the time I would just let me show you. Basically, yeah, this is my main brushes, and I think I don't use the full set, but my biggest guy is just simple round brush that allows me to block the values. And then I do love this one. It's from Greg Rutkowski set. It's just a nice way to get a texture. And yeah, that's really two that I do 95% of work with, and the rest I just I may switch sometimes, but I try to keep it as minimalistic as possible. And now what software, how can you maintain such a discipline and control in such code decisions? Well, I mean, you basically have to, and I think here's the thing, the references again. You gotta get your inspiration from the references, and sometimes it's movie frames, sometimes it's other people's photography. But since you get your inspiration, you have to deliver something that works in continuity, and that is the main goal for what you're doing. If you can't deliver 30 awesome looking frames that don't work for continuity, nobody needs it. So the discipline is the key. I would often just sample colors. Like if I did one painting that is sort of a master painting for the sequence, for the rest I would just go and sample it. And then, well, was it any different for working for Love, Death and Robots? We see working for Riot, doing stuff for Valorant. Yes and no. So one thing that obviously Love and Death and Robots for me pushes the limitations of what stories you can tell in animation, but also it is internal blur thing. So we develop stories and there is a lot of dialogue, so obviously we have a lot of control. We just basically do what we want, and it's just also the nature of the series to do what you want. But at the same time, I love working for Riot. And an interesting thing is that I am, as an artist, probably on a darker, minimalistic side of things. Like I love, subtleties, and I love darker images overall. And why I love League of Legends and Valorant is the fact that it just pushes my limits so much. It just, if you go from, let's say, Drowned Giant, who's just a body of a person lying on the beach, which is very much in my comfort zone of painting. And then you go to, let me quickly open it, to the images like this stuff here. That is just a huge contrast and rage, and that is what makes me better. I honestly, I can't wait to work on Riot stuff, just because it pushes the limits of what I can do, and I feel like I just benefit from it quite a bit. And by the way, this color script does use very similar idea. That is for the Riot Worlds cinematic, and the idea was very much the same. We have three sequences intercut together, and so you need to find the best way to separate them. So one is gold with the goldens, one is orange and green, and one is purple magenta. So the cut feels very obvious within the piece. Oh. Yeah, I'm looking, guys, for questions. I feel like I answered all of them. Oh, I feel... So, yeah. A good question. I feel like most of the times, to represent an emotion, director always use the same resources. For example, raining scene to depict sadness. Do you feel like going for the cliche is the safest option? I'm the guy who hates cliches for a number of reasons, really. So, a very simple example that I can just show you right away. You know how from noir era and 30s, people think that underlit characters do feel as villains, and you know, they feel uncomfortable, they feel as bad guys typically, and all the bad guys in movies tend to get underlighted, which is terrible oversimplification, because if you just go to shot deck and look what is underlit lighting conditions can give you emotionally, and like the Brad Pitt here from Assassination of Jesse Jones, it doesn't feel very villain, and you know, this boy here doesn't feel very villain as this person from Maleficent, and you will get the feeling that is, you know, a cliche, more of cliche, but it's actually, you know, it's quite rare. So I honestly hate. I don't like even talking about cliches, because you know, you, as I was talking in the beginning, you just gotta feel if that's appropriate for your story or not. Like, these guys don't feel like exactly like, you know, villains from 30s film noir, is that these guys, you know, they don't feel like villains. They feel like guys who are going for something, but it's not extreme. So yeah, as much as this may work, like, you know, in this shot from Fargo, yeah, that is the cliche that I felt like they went for cliche to just as a tribute to the genre rather than depicting characters' emotions, or a mix. It's a brilliant frame anyway. So yeah, I don't think that you need to take cliches seriously. It's good to be aware of them though. And for example, you know, often you would hear another good example is that red and green gives you a Christmas mood, and you generally, you know, should avoid it. But when I look at this movie, Enter the Void, which is about drug scene in Tokyo, the last thing I think is Christmas. So it just, cliches don't work, really. Rain for the sadness, you know, it depends on how, it basically depends how art directed, you know, how heavy you want people to see it. I do like art directions that people don't necessarily notice. In ideal world, as a person who helps to guide audience emotions, you want audience to feel emotions, but you don't want them to notice. So if you can avoid cliches like rain in the sad scene, that I think is a good thing. Well, how do I avoid cliche? That comes again to this slide that I showed here. You know, three persons sitting in the car and three different shots. And the shots are different because these characters go through different emotions, and they are in a very different life situations, and just internalizing the story and feeling the story is the way to try, and you know, not only feeling the story but trying to feel subtleties of the story is what sort of helps, I think, to avoid cliches, but also it is something, again, if you are emotionally into the story and if you found your way into it, that's something that will also make you very unique in telling this story, and that is, I feel like, just how you can avoid it. Do you have an all-time favorite movie? I have a bunch. Honestly, it's just such. I would go for the genre. I used to love. I mean, and when I say I used to love, I used to watch like 100 times Apocalypse Now. I just rewatched a bunch of Tarkovsky movies, which is The Mirror and Stalker. I obviously love Stanley Kubrick. I love David Fincher. But then, from the movies that I just saw most times in my life, that would be Apocalypse Now, number one. Ridiculously, The Gladiator by Ridley Scott, number two. And even more strange, but it just comes probably to me. I just like the stories, the Sin City, the original one. What is your freedom about the local colors of the elements in the scene, like cloth, walls, or furniture? Normally your work is based mainly on suggested properties and colors for lights. I try to control the outfits of the characters, especially in the APs that we do. And it's sort of a big decision you usually need to make on, early on in production. The one thing that just immediately comes to my mind, just as a reference how you should do it, is a Fight Club. David Fincher is known as a guy who avoids magenta and reds, but then the Brad Pitt jacket in this movie is like full-on magenta red, and there is a bunch of different these, and that's what makes him stick out. And I think, if you can really maintain the temperature and the color palette through the movie, and make one red scene in the full movie, this is just very cool. And then it's the Fight Club, and I can't find the perfect examples right now, but I just remember there was like just crazy bright reds in it, and then in the jacket, and it's not one jacket, it's just always something red. And then the other is Seven by Fincher, but there is a brilliant use of white t-shirts. There is a couple of shots when the character is just so well separated, and white t-shirt is often a challenge. It kind of gets a lot of attention away from the human face, but if you look at the setup like that, it's just a very nice example. I try to go for it. When we work for cinematics, you don't control this way, you don't control outfit this way, but if you work for the Love, Death and Robots, we do make these decisions. And a good example is red dress in Pop Squad. If you remember the party scene, there was a very intentional decision to make it red. What are your go-to colors to isolate a character focus in a scene where you want the audience to look at? Well, first I would say isolate a character with value. That is the first thing, If you look even at this frame, but Morgan Freeman is separate just because he's a brighter shape over darker background. And here is the other way around. He's a darker shape over brighter background, and that is the first thing. And then if you go to, I just rewatched yesterday the Mirror film by Tarkovsky. Oh, sorry guys, let me show you. There's some brilliant color separation, and I mean, this is filtered, it's not how it appears in the movie, but this very brilliant color separation between the warm skin tones and the subtle greens and cyans in the background, that is the way, and that is something that so many paintings are go around, and yeah, that is something I try to use from time to time. Okay, David A asking, maybe it's off topic, but I was wondering how the production worked, because I see that sometimes you have 3D scenes as a reference while others are completely drawn. Just curiosity. It really depends on the station. Now, on a Drowned Giant, for example, I had I had Unreal Engine set up that wasn't used for rendering, but that I just used for visual development, and that is the setup that was created by Epic Games team that just helped us, and then I updated and maintained it, and that is where 3D comes in these frames. And I did also a lot of photography around California for just beaches and trying to understand how the color and works and things like that. So that is sort of, it came early. Sometimes later in the game, you would get a first pass of layout, and you would just use compositions from what guys are doing in layout. And I often render, like, for example, in Lifehash, I think I rendered a lot of these, but this is not production 3D. What basically happened is that we were struggling with communicating scale for alien structure, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna render, get some basic setup on Houdini, because then I can use it for multiple shots. And so I got this setup to just understand the scale, and then that's how 3D came to a lot of these shots. It just was logical to go with 3D. Whereas, for example, here on Pop Squad, here's the thing: I wasn't confident in many decisions I'm making, and I wanted to experiment fast. So, and I wanted to do more than 1 frame a day. I wanted to do 3-4 frames a day with the experimentation. So I went, one brush, super loose paintings, just to get. Often based on storyboards or early layout, or just done from scratch, but just something that to get very basic idea and be able to experiment. So it really depends on the production situation, but again, often it's based on our layout, and I think I'll render something in 30% of times. Other times I will just repaint it. And okay, can you talk about your artistic journey and how you ended up working with Love, Death and Robots? Did they contact you, or you applied for a job? I don't know if you already talked about it. My artistic journey is the weirdest one. So I worked a lot in Russia, and I started as a scientist, almost. Not a scientist, but I basically was writing code and doing setups in Houdini and writing shaders. And then very slowly, in course of maybe 10 years, I transitioned to artistic side of things and started to paint more and more and more. And then I found myself in Platige Image, which is a great studio in Poland, which does game cinematics. And then I contacted Blur 4 years ago, a little more, and they maybe 5 years ago, and they just went and hired me. So I wasn't hired for Love, Death and Robots. I was just hired as a staff guy for Blur, and then I transitioned to Love, Death and Robots. Okay, next question. Do you think of flow and rhythm while composing scenes and framing, as in more of motion rather than story progression? Well, I do think about the flow, but I'm sort of a painting guy, so I think more about the shape rather than the line, if it makes sense. So I think what is like, if I start to compose something, I would just have an abstract shape, like This is what's gonna be dark. This is what's gonna be bright. How the shapes relate. What is big? What is small? You know, what is darker? What is closer to the camera? What is further away? How it describes space and things like that. So I'm not a flow really guy. I'm not a line guy really. First, I suck in line drawing. Honestly, I need to be honest. But second, just the way I think about things. I'm very value kind of guy. I need to, before I start an image, I decide what's darker, what's brighter in this image, right? Is the character darker? Like here, the character is a dark shape of a bright background, or like here, with his face is brighter over, you know, grayish, darker background. So I first decide the general value, and then I'll go from there and just try to compose it nicely. Yep. Yeah, I think, guys, I've answered all the questions. Let me know in chat if there is any other. Anyway, thank you for joining me, and thank you for listening to me, and thanks Lightbox for having me. It's a pleasure to be a part of it. And please feel free to reach out either on Instagram or ArtStation or whatever is comfortable for you. If you want to, if you have any questions or want to talk, please feel free to reach out. I'll be ending streaming now because it seems I've answered all the questions and showed you everything I wanted. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.